The world sees ruin, a cracked farmhouse held together by debt, and the weary eyes of an old man who should have quit decades ago. Tragedy has been his constant companion, stripping away his possessions, his physical strength, and his entire future. Yet, beneath the layers of defeat, a strange, beautiful fire remains. To outsiders, this unyielding persistence looks exactly like madness, a stubborn refusal to mourn what has been lost. He has lost everything worth keeping, save for the absolute conviction that the promise of tomorrow is still valid. The first light of June 12, 2025, scraped across the dusty floorboards of my bedroom, indifferent to the weariness it found there. I am Arthur Farrow, and at 72 years old, the sun is no longer a promise. It's just the start of another long drag across the unforgiving face of the earth. I rose slowly, the sound of my joints grinding a familiar gravelly chorus. Every muscle in my body protested, a silent, screaming litany against the life I insisted on living. I caught sight of myself in the cracked mirror, hanging precariously above the dresser. It was a cheap, warbled piece of glass, reflecting a man I barely recognized, a gaunt frame draped loosely in faded cotton, sparse grey hair clinging to a skull that seemed too large for my body, and blue eyes that held the relentless, tired depth of the plains themselves. They called me the biggest fool in the county now, the old man who refuses to quit a fight he already lost. They see the exhaustion, the failing strength, the monumental debt, but they miss the furnace burning deep beneath the ruins. They confuse the appearance of defeat with the actual loss of will. This farm, the Dust Bowl claim, stretches out around the dilapidated farmhouse like a permanent scar. I inherited this land in 1980, full of youth and certainty, believing I could tame the dry, angry soil. 45 years later, the land has consumed my strength, demanding tribute in sweat, bone, and solvency, always giving back just enough to keep the misery alive. The air was already thick and dry when I stepped out onto the rocking chair porch. This porch is my sentinel post. It faces the long, empty dirt road, a ribbon of white dust cutting through the scrubland. I have been watching that road every day since 2013, the year everything that mattered to me was ripped away. I sat down, the old wood groaning beneath my weight, and nursed a cup of coffee strong enough to strip paint. The routine is sacred, an offering to the day that might, just might, bring the impossible. They talk about acceptance. Acceptance is a word for those who don't know what true love demands. My love for my son, Elias Eli Farrow, 24 years old when fate decided to snatch him, is not a memory to be packed away neatly. It is the reason the sun still bothers to rise. I spent the better part of the morning battling the rusted Ford 4000. That tractor is as stubborn and weathered as I am, a symbol of the legacy that failed us both. I poured oil, I coaxed, I cursed, and finally, with a shuddering cough that sounded like its last breath, it came alive. I had 3 acres of marginally productive soil left to turn. Neighbors say I should be playing checkers or watching the news, not subjecting my failing joints to the violence of the vibrating metal seat. But how can I leave the field fallow when Eli might be on his way home, looking for the familiar sight of his father working the dirt? By 10 o'clock, the dust was already swirling, a fine red curtain drawn across the horizon. I needed more fuel, and more importantly, I needed to face the judgment of the town. So I drove the old pickup, tires spitting gravel, toward the only place in the county where everyone knows your name and your shame, the Whistle Stop Diner. The Whistle Stop smelled of burnt grease and industrial cleaner. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the sticky vinyl booths and the faces clustered within them. As soon as I pushed open the door, the ambient noise dropped a notch. The silence wasn't respectful, it was anticipatory. They were waiting to see if today was the day the fool finally looked broken. I slid into the usual booth by the window, the one that gave me a clear view of the road leading back to the farm. Almost immediately, Mabel Jenkins, 68 years old and the unofficial historian and moral compass of this tiny town, planted herself across the table. Mabel is a sturdy woman, perpetually encased in a clean, white apron, with a pragmatic gaze that could drill holes through steel. She never whispers. She just announces the truth as she sees it. "Arthur Farrow," she started, her voice a low rumble that still carried to the counter. "You look like hell warmed over. Did you sleep at all, or did you spend the night nursing that old rust heap?" "I slept fine, Mabel," I lied, accepting the chipped ceramic mug of coffee she placed before me. The coffee was lethal, but necessary. "No, you didn't," she countered, settling into the booth. "You've got that hollow look again. You're working yourself into the grave, Arthur. And for what? That land hasn't turned a profit since Eli was in high school." I held my gaze steady, refusing to flinch under her scrutiny. "It's my land, Mabel, my responsibility. It's a dust claim, Arthur, not a kingdom. And that boy," she stopped herself, catching the sudden hardness in my eyes. She knew better than to say the word gone outright, but the implication hung in the air like exhaust. "I'm not selling," I said, the words simple, absolute. Mabel sighed, a dramatic, weary sound that echoed the frustration of the entire community. "Arthur, it's 2025. It's been 12 years since the vanishing. 12 years since Eli Farrow packed a bag and drove away. There was no foul play, Arthur. No accident reports, no notes, just silence. He wanted a different life. He didn't say goodbye," I insisted, stirring my coffee until the spoon scraped the bottom of the mug. "He was energetic, yes, always seeking the adventure this dust couldn't offer, but he wouldn't have left without a word. Not Eli. He had too much heart for that. He was too much like his mother, rest her soul." Mabel's expression softened slightly, betraying the genuine concern beneath her pragmatic shell. "We all loved Eli, Arthur. Broad shoulders, kind smile. He was the best of you. But sometimes, love means letting the hope die, so the rest of you can live. You confuse hope with naivety, Mabel," I said quietly, leaning forward, so only she could hear the next part. "My hope is a deliberate refusal to let go. It's the only thing I have left that time hasn't stolen. It is the measure of my affection. If I stop believing Hayes coming back, then I lose him completely, and that is a devastation I refuse to allow." I paid for my coffee, ignoring her further protests about needing actual food, and left the diner. I could feel their eyes on my back, the pity, the judgment, the weary acceptance that Arthur Farrow was truly and irrevocably mad. Back at the farm, the afternoon heat was oppressive. I parked the pickup and walked straight to the mantelpiece, drawn by the single most important object in my ruined home, Eli's baseball glove. It sat on the rough wood, cured by sun and sweat, still holding the faint, ghost impression of his hand. I picked it up, the leather cool and smooth beneath my deeply weathered hands. The memories hit with the force of a sudden storm. Eli Farrow was the embodiment of everything good I thought I'd built on this dusty land. I remember 2013 vividly. The year was supposed to be a turning point. We had finally, after years of drought, managed a decent harvest. Eli, who was 24, had just finished community college, though he hadn't wanted to stay on the farm. He loved the speed of life, the noise of cities, the possibility beyond the empty horizon. I understood the call of adventure, but I had hoped he would answer it by staying. The last conversation was mundane, devastatingly so. He was packing for a short trip to visit a friend in the city, promising he'd be back in a week to help with the late planting. He stood in the doorway, sun hitting his dark hair, giving him that intense resemblance to young Arthur, before the land had hollowed me out. "Don't work the Ford too hard, Pa," had said, grabbing his worn duffel bag. "I won't. You drive safe, son." And then he was gone. A week passed. Then two. His friend called, confused. Eli had never shown up. The truck was still parked in the city lot, keys under the seat, but Eli was nowhere. The police, after a few months of fruitless searching, filed it as a voluntary disappearance. They said he simply decided not to come back. They couldn't understand that a Farrow, especially one as fiercely loyal as Eli, would never voluntarily inflict that kind of pain. The pain of the vanishing isn't just loss. It's the constant, gnawing absence of explanation. It's an anchor I drag through every moment, heavier than the rusted Ford 4000 stuck in a ditch. I squeezed the baseball glove, trying to compress the 12 years of agony into that single, solid piece of leather. It was almost evening now, the shadows stretching long and brittle across the yard. I knew what was coming. Mabel's persistent questions at the diner were merely the softening of the soil before the real assault. I had been avoiding my phone calls all week, ignoring the certified letters from the bank. But I couldn't ignore the rumbling of trucks pulling up the drive. It was the neighborly intervention. 3 vehicles, dust still settling around their tires, gathered near the dilapidated barn. Leading the procession was Mabel, looking stern and purposeful. With her were Pastor Thomas, a kind man who had tried to counsel me into acceptance many times, and old Mr. Henderson, who represented the bank's interests and the local land consolidation effort. This wasn't a social visit. This was the community delivering its final verdict. I walked down off the porch and met them near the truck. The silence between us was thick, weighty, with unspoken pity and exasperation. "Arthur," Pastor Thomas began gently, stepping forward, "we are here as friends and neighbors, not as judges. We are worried about you." "I am fine, Pastor," I replied, my voice steady, though I could feel the tremor in my hands. I slipped Eiley's glove into my back pocket. It provided a small, psychological shield. Mr. Henderson, impeccably dressed considering the dirt road, held out a manila envelope. "Farrow, this is a formal appeal. The farm is in breach of several terms. The infrastructure is failing, the land isn't producing the yield required by the loan." "I'll fix the infrastructure," I interrupted. "I'll repair the barn." "With what money, Arthur? And who will do the labor? You're 72 years old. You need to accept what is gone. The crops, the profit, the stability." "And yes," Mabel said, looking me straight in the eye, "Eli, you need to accept that the life you lost will not magically find its way back home." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. They believed my continuous hope was the delusion of an exhausted mind, a sign of weakness. They thought I was holding on to a childish fantasy. I took a deep breath, letting the exhaustion of living flood my senses, the ache in my spine, the perpetual dryness of my throat, the metallic taste of dust. They were right that I was exhausted, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my faith. "You speak of acceptance," I said, my voice rising slightly, startling them all. "But you mistake my vigil for mere stubbornness. This farm isn't just dirt and debt to me. It is the only fixed point in a world that became chaos in 2013. This is where Eli left, and therefore, this is where he knows to return." I walked toward the weathered side of the house, the sun setting now, painting the horizon in shades of violent orange and bruised purple. "Every morning," I continued, turning back to face them, "I wake up believing that the magnitude of my affection for that boy is greater than the immense exhaustion of living. You see a foolish old man clinging to memory. I see a father fulfilling a promise." I pulled the baseball glove from my pocket and held it out, letting them see the worn leather, the silent testimony to a bond they couldn't measure in currency. "If I sell this land, I am declaring him dead. I am erasing the beacon. I am admitting that time and fate were stronger than my love. I will not make that admission. I cannot. Because if Eli walks down that road tomorrow, and the farm is gone, then I have truly failed him. I refuse to acknowledge defeat." Henderson shuffled the papers, clearly frustrated by this emotional entanglement. "Farrow, hope doesn't pay the mortgage. We are talking about financial ruin." This was the climax, the moment where I had to choose between sensible survival and the magnificent, foolish act of believing. "I understand the risk," I said, my voice hardening into granite, "and I refuse your offer. I will not sell the Dust Bowl claim." Mabel stepped forward, her caring nature momentarily winning out over her practicality. "Arthur, please, what is your plan? How will you keep this land solvent? The soil is spent." I smiled then, a tired, genuine smile that hadn't touched my face in years. It was the smile of a man who had just made an impossible decision based on an unshakable truth. "The soil is spent, you're right, so I'm going to plant something that no one expects to see here. Something that requires constant tending, something that proves my faith is active, not passive." They looked confused. This was beyond their realm of understanding financial and agricultural sanity, was battling radical, stubborn love. "I'm planting sunflowers," I announced. "Sunflowers don't make sense here. They're too tall, they require too much water, and they won't yield profit. But when they grow, they will turn their faces to the sun, and they will be visible for miles. A wall of yellow, impossible color, cutting through the dust. A sign for what?" Mabel asked, aghast. "A sign that I am still here, that this house is still home, that the father who loves him is still watching the road," I stated. "I have lost everything, my youth, my strength, my son, but I have not lost the capacity to signal my affection." The three of them exchanged glances. They knew there was no arguing with this level of conviction. It was madness, perhaps, but it was also a profound, beautiful declaration of paternity. Henderson tucked the envelope back under his arm. Defeated by sentimentality, he couldn't itemize on a spreadsheet. "We will be in touch, Mr. Farrow. But understand, the clock is ticking." Mabel lingered, her usually piercing gaze clouded with worry. She reached out and briefly touched my forearm. "You are an impossible man, Arthur Farrow." "I know, Mabel. Thank you for worrying." They drove away, the dust cloud following them until they turned onto the main highway, leaving me alone once more with the silent expanse of the farm. The crisis was averted momentarily. The price was paid in solitude and the knowledge that I had chosen faith over financial security. The next morning, before the real heat set in, I was out in the field. I didn't fire up the rusted Ford 4000. That was for mundane crops. This required hand labor. I took the small bag of sunflower seeds I had bought in secret and began tilling the soil nearest to the road. The dirt was dry and unwilling, but I worked with a renewed, desperate energy. This was not about yielding a profit. It was about yielding a statement. I worked until my bones screamed, until my shirt was plastered to my back, until the sun had climbed high enough to bake the landscape. Finally, I retreated to the rocking chair porch, settling in for my lonely cup of coffee, facing the long, empty dirt road. It was June 13th, the anniversary of nothing, yet the promise of everything. I sat there, 72 years old, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been brutally simplified by tragedy. I was poor, exhausted, and utterly alone, yet in the quiet air, a different kind of strength settled over me. I had seeds in the ground that should not be there. I had faced the community's judgment and chosen the path of radical persistence. I looked out at the empty horizon sunrise, watching the dust motes dance in the violent morning light. I carried the burden of having lost everything, yet I still rose each day believing. I hadn't planted the sunflowers, expecting them to solve my debt or bring rain, or even guarantee Elis's physical return. I planted them because they were a physical manifestation of a truth I clung to, that the heart of a father is more stubborn than the soil, more resilient than time, and brighter than the devastating darkness of absence. My story is a testament to that magnificent, foolish act of believing. I may be the biggest fool in the county, watching a dusty road for a son who left 12 years ago. But I know this. If love is the last thing you have left, then you have not truly lost everything. And so I waited and I watched, knowing that even if the horizon remained empty today, the seeds of impossible hope were already in the ground, reaching for the light. That was enough. That was my victory. I spent the next 3 days moving water. The decision to plant sunflowers was not just romantic. It was an act of extreme physical violence against my own 72-year-old body. The Dust Bowl claim had no efficient irrigation system left. The pipes had been corroded by 4 decades of hard water and neglect. So I hauled. I coaxed the rusted Ford 4000 to pull an ancient, battered 50-gallon steel drum on a rudimentary trailer from the deep well near the old silo, down the rutted, half-mile path to the roadside planting area. The Ford, rattling and wheezing, struggled with the weight, sounding every bit as exhausted as I felt. Each trip took an hour, and I managed only 4 before the heat of the day threatened to cook me inside my skin. The sun here wasn't warm, it was predatory. It sucked the moisture from the air, the soil, and my joints with equal, ruthless efficiency. My deeply weathered hands, usually tough and impervious, were cracked and bleeding from hauling the heavy, dry ropes and lifting the filled 5-gallon buckets necessary to distribute the water by hand. The land fought back against the seeds. The soil, which should have been soft and welcoming, was compacted hard pan, unwilling to surrender its arid grip. I had planted the seeds shallow, giving them the best chance, but keeping them moist under the direct, killing glare of the June sky was a Sisyphean torment. I found myself talking to the ground, whispering pleas to the dirt, promising the parched earth life if it would only, briefly, share its meager resources. It was humiliating, this pleading with the inanimate, but necessity strips you of dignity quickly. Mabel avoided the whistle-stop diner entirely for a week. I saw her old pickup driving past the main highway, never turning onto the dirt track. The silence from the town wasn't just judgment anymore. It was the isolation of pity. They had offered the life raft, and I had chosen to paddle further out to sea in a sieve. Now they were simply watching me sink. The loneliness of the work was a profound, heavy thing. When I was younger, when Eli was here, even the hardest labor felt shared. I would hear his booming, slightly off-key singing over the roar of the tractor, or the sharp, encouraging whistle when I was lifting something too heavy. Now the only sound was the rasp of my own breathing and the frantic ticking of the cooling engine of the Ford. The farm had always been a tribute to my tenacity, but now it felt like a monument to my folly. I would collapse onto the rocking chair porch in the late evening, the aches in my failing joints so intense they felt less like pain and more like a separate, malevolent entity inhabiting my body. I would watch the long, empty road, the orange dust slowly settling, and ask the silence, what if they are right? What if this love is simply madness? My hope, which I had called a deliberate refusal to let go, began to feel like a delusion maintained through brute force. I had chosen a symbolic crop, but symbols require maintenance, and maintenance required a strength I simply did not possess anymore. One evening, I found myself staring into the cracked mirror. The light in the farmhouse was poor, casting the reflection in shadows that made the lines on my face look like trenches. Gaunt frame, sparse grey hair, tired blue eyes. I saw the man the world judged. A man worn down by the tragedy of 2013 and the sheer, unending physical demands of the land inherited in 1980. I reached into the pocket of my work shirt and found Elisa's baseball glove, which I now carried almost constantly, a habit I had developed since the neighborly intervention. I needed the anchor of the real, tangible past. I sat down heavily by the fireplace, running my thumb over the worn, sweat-stained leather. It smelled of dirt and youth. I remembered a conversation from the summer before the vanishing. Eli had been 23, bursting with the adventurous energy that this flat, dusty horizon could never satisfy. We were sitting right here, on this floor, cleaning and oiling our equipment. Pa had said, leaning back against the cool stone. I love this place, but it's sucking the air right out of my lungs. I need to see what else is out there. I had felt the familiar, heavy disappointment, the fear that my legacy would die with me. This is your home, son. This dirt is in your blood. It is, Eli countered, his kind smile softening the blow. But you know I don't want to work the rusted Ford 4000 until I look like you do. I want to build something different. And what happens when the road runs out, Eli? Where do you come back to? He looked at me then, his eyes intense, the spitting image of young Arthur. I'll come back here. No matter what I build, this place and you will always be the baseline. The promise. That was the word that mattered. He hadn't promised to stay. He had promised to return. And when he packed his bag and drove away in 2013, leaving only silence, that promise was the only thing that kept me from collapsing entirely. The police had decided he simply changed his mind. I knew my son. He wouldn't have broken that promise without a reason beyond his control. I gripped the glove tighter. My stubbornness wasn't just about refusing to sell the land. It was about honoring his final, unspoken commitment. I needed to keep the light on, not for the prodigal son, but for the son who needed to know his baseline was secure. The next day, the immense exhaustion of living finally exacted its toll. I was trying to maneuver the heavy steel water drum, attempting a tighter turn near the roadside fence line, when the rusted Ford 4000 gave up the ghost. It wasn't the usual cough and splutter. It was a violent, metallic shriek, a sound of grinding defeat, followed by an absolute, final silence. The tractor lurched, the drums swung wide, and the whole mechanism settled into the dusty earth with a heavy sigh. I tried the ignition. Nothing. I tried the starter cable. It wasn't a simple blockage. It was structural failure, a culmination of decades of deferred maintenance and brutal use. The Ford was dead. The symbol of my failed legacy, the engine of my daily persistence, was now just a massive, useless weight in the dust. Frustration, hot and blinding, surged through me. Without the Ford, I could not haul water. Without water, the fragile, impossible hope, represented by the sunflower seeds, would shrivel and die in days. I climbed down, my tired blue eyes wide with panic. I grabbed a wrench from the toolbox and started frantically pulling at connections, checking the fuel line, the spark plugs, anything. I cursed the machine, the land, and my own foolish, magnificent act of believing. You will not beat me. I yelled into the silent, dusty air, my voice raw and unfamiliar. I leaned against the heavy iron fender, pushing, trying to somehow physically will the engine back to life. My feet slipped on the dry ground, and I went down hard, my hip striking the sharp corner of the tractor tire. A blinding shock of pain ripped through my side, followed by a sickening, hollow crunch that echoed in the sudden silence. I lay in the dust, gasping. The pain was immediate and absolute, cutting off my breath. My hip felt disjointed, a useless hinge. I couldn't move. The sun beat down, turning the dust around me into an oven. Time stretched and warped. I was miles from the farmhouse, utterly incapacitated, lying next to the massive, defunct Ford, with the knowledge that the young seeds were baking to death a few yards away. This was the true devastation, the brutal climax of my physical decline. It wasn't the loss of the farm. It was the loss of the ability to tend the hope. Lying there, gazing up at the indifferent sky, the exhaustion of living finally overshadowed the magnitude of my affection. They were right, a cynical voice whispered in my mind. You are just an old fool. You can't fight fate. You can't even fight gravity. For the first time since 2013, I allowed the full, cold wave of acceptance to wash over me. The pain was too great, the failure to complete. Eli was gone. The farm was bankrupt. I was broken. I had held the line for 12 years, dragging that anchor of agony, but now the anchor had dragged me down too. Tears, hot and salty, cut paths through the grit on my cheeks. They weren't tears of grief, but tears of surrender. I had fought the good fight, but the sheer physical impossibility of maintaining the beacon had beaten me. I lay there for perhaps an hour, waiting for the shadows to lengthen, hoping perhaps for the random passage of a neighbor. No one came. The road remained empty, stretching out to the horizon like a taunt. Finally, relying on pure adrenaline-fueled stubbornness, the very quality Mabel had condemned, I began the agonizing process of crawling. Inch by searing inch, I dragged myself across the dirt, away from the dead tractor toward the distant, dilapidated farmhouse. Every movement sent fresh shocks of agony through my hip. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the porch steps. I didn't stop to sit on the rocking chair. I dragged myself inside, collapsing onto the dusty floor, the pain now a deep, burning throb. It was twilight. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything since dawn. I managed to reach the phone and call Mabel, not to ask for help with the farm or the bank, but simply to state, "Mabel, I fell. I need a lift to the clinic." Mabel arrived within 20 minutes, her pragmatic gaze softening into immediate, intense worry when she saw me pale and sweating on the floor. She called the ambulance herself, refusing to move me further, speaking in low, clipped tones to the medics when they arrived. At the tiny county hospital, they confirmed a fractured hip. Surgery was required. Lying in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the hospital room, away from the dust and the heat, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The decision had been taken out of my hands. The farm was now entirely fallow. The sunflowers, unwatered for a day and facing another 2 days of intense heat while I was hospitalized, were certainly doomed. Mabel came every day. She brought lukewarm hospital coffee and quiet concern. I closed my eyes. The image of the wilting sunflower seeds burning behind my lids. "Tell them I won't," I managed, the medication making my words thick. "Arthur, you can't even walk. You won't be able to work that land for 6 months, maybe more. How can you hold on to it now?" "It's not about working the land, Mabel. It's about the promise," I insisted, the pain in my hip, an echo of the deeper spiritual ache. "I have to be there. I have to hold the baseline." "But the flowers, Arthur," she said gently. "They're done for. They were dry yesterday morning." I swallowed hard. The sunflowers had been the visible proof of my magnificent act, the public declaration of my faith. Now, even that symbol was destroyed. "Then I'll plant new ones," I said, looking at the ceiling, refusing to meet her gaze. "When I get home, I'll plant new ones. The promise doesn't end because of a fracture. It ends when I stop believing." Mabel stared at me for a long moment. She didn't argue this time. She only shook her head, a slow, weary motion that conveyed both exasperation and grudging respect. "You are an impossible man, Arthur." When I was finally released, a week later, I was dependent on a walker, a humiliating concession to my age and my broken body. Mabel drove me back to the Dust Bowl claim, the site of the dilapidated farmhouse. The empty fields, and the massive, rusting hulk of the Ford 4000 near the road was a testament to total collapse. I made my way slowly, painfully, onto the rocking chair porch. The first thing I noticed was the absolute silence. The second was the color. Mabel was pulling the pickup away, leaving me alone with my silence and my walker when I spotted it. The field I had tilled and seeded by the roadside was no longer just red dust. Cutting through the unforgiving, arid expanse was a thin, determined line of green. Tiny, fragile, but undeniably alive, the sunflower sprouts had broken the surface. Mabel had seen them too. She slammed on the brakes 50 yards down the road and reversed, crunching gravel as she pulled back up the drive. "Arthur," she breathed, walking slowly toward the fence line, looking at the miracle. "I thought they were dead. The heat, they hadn't been watered for 5 days, exposed to the kind of punishing summer sun that kills established crops, let alone fresh seeds. Yet here they were, dozens of miniature stems, bravely pushing their way up. They were small, no more than an inch high, but they were the radical, foolish belief made manifest. I leaned heavily on the porch railing, tears welling up again, But this time there were tears of awe. They found the moisture, I whispered, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this absolute, unlocked-for victory. They're deep-rooted. They survived. Mabel walked back to me, her practical gaze utterly defeated by the miracle of the sprouts. She looked from the tiny green line to my fractured hip, to the dead tractor, and finally into my eyes. "Arthur," she started, her voice barely a whisper, "how are you going to water them now? You can't move those barrels." I didn't look at the tractor or the hip. I looked at the long, empty dirt road. "I won't stop, Mabel. I'll figure it out. If they can survive 5 days of this, I can find a way to keep them alive. I'll bring some water from my place tomorrow, Arthur," she said, her voice gruff. "But just for these. Don't think this means I've gone soft on your financials." "Thank you, Mabel," I said, my voice thick with emotion. She drove away, and I was alone again. I eased myself into the rocking chair, the wood groaning a familiar welcome. The sun was beginning its spectacular descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange. I sat there until darkness swallowed the horizon. I was physically ruined. The bank was circling. The machinery of my life was broken. But 2013 had taken my son, and time had taken everything else. Yet they had not taken this, the sight of those tenacious green shoots. I was the biggest fool in the county, yet my belief had yielded life where there should have been none. My story isn't about the return of a missing son, or the sudden solvency of a bankrupt farm. It is a testament to the fact that, when you have lost everything, the single persistent act of maintaining your love, that's magnificent, foolish act of believing, is the truest form of victory. I may watch the road on the rocking chair porch with a fractured body, but now I watch it next to a growing, impossible field of sunflowers. They are reaching for the sun, a visible, defiant signal cutting through the dust. The promise is active. The baseline is secure, and that, I know, is enough. I closed my eyes, the metallic taste of dust on my tongue, and waited for tomorrow. I had done my part. The rest was up to the vast, empty horizon. The walker was a metallic insult. It squeaked, grated, and forced me to view the world from a hunched-over, geriatric vantage point. Every step from the kitchen to the rocking chair porch was a calculated exercise in weight distribution, a painful, agonizing triumph over simple mechanics. I had commanded the land for 45 years. Now, I was enslaved by 6 pounds of aluminum tubing. I parked the walker at the railing, easing my gaunt frame into the familiar groove of the rocking chair. The porch floor was dusty, untouched by a broom since the fracture, and the sight of the defunct Ford 4000, massive and dark like a fallen sentinel, was a constant, heavy reminder of my physical defeat. Yet, beyond the Ford, defying the drought, the hard pan, and the searing afternoon sun, were the sprouts. They were still small, a delicate, fragile green against the brutal red of the soil, but they were growing. Each tiny leaf, curled and reaching, represented a direct, defiant negation of every cynical whisper I had ever heard. They were the visible language of my magnificent, foolish act, and they were speaking volumes. "Don't get up, Arthur," she'd bark, already walking toward the roadside fence. Our interactions were minimal, stripped down to the necessities of survival. I was the keeper of the hope, and she, against every pragmatic bone in her body, had become the water-bearer. She was irrigating my delusion, and she hated every minute of it, which made her persistence even more poignant. One morning she stayed a bit longer, leaning against the railing next to the walker, watching the sprouts. They had gained height, now standing perhaps 3 inches tall, their stems thickening slightly. "They shouldn't be this deep-rooted yet," Mabel observed, shaking her head. "They must have been fighting for moisture since the day you put them in." "A fighter, like the boy who planted them," I murmured. Mabel didn't challenge the comparison. The unspoken pain of Elias vanishing hung permanently between us, a heavy curtain only slightly lifted by the presence of the sprouts. She knew deep down that the seeds I planted weren't just sunflower seeds. They were 12 years of desperate, unspent paternal love sown into the dirt. Her help, though grudgingly offered and limited only to the immediate area of the sprouts, was the only thing keeping the promise alive. Without her, the physical limitations imposed by the fractured hip were absolute. The maximum range of my walker was 30 feet from the porch. Beyond that, the desert won. But I needed more than 30 feet. I needed to fix the ford. I needed to move the water drums again. I needed to reclaim my capacity. The sheer frustration of being immobile became a dull, constant ache that rivaled the pain in my hip. I spent hours sitting on the porch, staring at the dead ford, planning the repair mentally. I knew the grinding shriek had indicated a catastrophic failure, likely the transmission or the primary drive shaft. Complicated, heavy work requiring lifts and immense strength. Strength I no longer possess. I began making small, agonizing excursions to the dead tractor. Armed with a long screwdriver and a rag, I would drag myself, pushing the walker ahead a few feet, then pulling my ruined body after it. The round trip, which a week ago I would have managed in 5 minutes, now took an hour of sweat and searing pain. I wasn't attempting repair. I was performing triage. I was cleaning the external oil buildup, wiping the grime from the engine block, treating the machine with a reverence it hadn't received in years. It was an apology, perhaps, to the Ford for pushing it to the breaking point. One afternoon I sat next to the enormous, rusty front wheel, resting my back against the tire, the same tire that had delivered the sickening blow to my hip. I ran my hand over the scarred metal. This tractor was more than a tool. It was the entire timeline of my life. It was 1980, the year I inherited the land, when the Ford was new, shiny, and powerful, symbolizing the endless potential of youth. It was 2013, the year Eli drove away. The Ford idling in the distance as he waved, oblivious to the fact that he was leaving a permanent vacuum behind. And it was 2025, when the Ford, like me, lay broken and defeated in the dust. I reached for my breast pocket and pulled out Elias's baseball glove. The leather was warm from the sun. I held it in my lap, rubbing the stitching. I remembered Eli, maybe 13 years old, trying to teach me a complicated hitch knot, convinced that farm life should be taught with the precision of maritime navigation. He had this boundless energy, a refusal to accept the limitations of the land. "If you want something to survive here, Pa," he had said, pointing out to the unforgiving fields, "you can't just plant it, you have to anchor it." He meant spiritually, not physically. He meant that if the land was going to drain you, you needed an internal reserve, a non-negotiable reason to keep tending. My hope was my anchor. The sprouts were its latest visible manifestation. The problem was, anchors need maintenance. The sun started to dip low, turning the dust golden. I struggled to stand, the hip screaming a protest that seemed to carry across the empty fields. I managed to shuffle back to the porch, leaning heavily on the walker, leaving the Ford half-cleaned, a silent, monumental failure. That evening, the first real test of my renewed resolve arrived, not in the form of physical pain, but in the cold, hard currency of financial reality. They represented the world that saw my persistence as pathetic. They had come for the surrender I had so far refused to grant. "She's resting," I corrected, my voice dry. Henderson didn't waste time on pleasantries. He opened his briefcase on the porch railing, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Farrow, the bank requires an immediate response regarding the outstanding debt, which has now reached critical status. Given your current medical condition and the total loss of your essential equipment, we have to assume the land is no longer being actively farmed." "I am actively farming," I countered, gesturing with my chin toward the tiny green line by the road. "Look." Henderson glanced over. His tailored brow furrowed slightly at the sight of the minuscule sprouts. He saw weeds, I saw defiance. "With respect, sir, those are minor volunteer plants. They do not constitute viable cultivation necessary to service your loan. They are sunflowers," I stated firmly. "They are going to be 50 feet tall." The phrase, "it's over," hit me with the force of the Ford's catastrophic failure. They confused the failure of my body with the failure of my resolve. They saw the shell, but not the enduring fire within. "Jim," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "do you know why I planted those sunflowers?" He shrugged. "Publicity. Spite. I planted them because Eli promised to come back here. He called this place the baseline, the promise." I gripped the armrest of the rocker. "If I sell this land, I am declaring that the promise is broken. That my love for him is conditional on my physical health or my bank account. And it is not." Henderson sighed, exasperated. "Farrow, this is not a court of sentiment. It is a court of law. You are facing foreclosure. We need a signature by Monday morning, or the proceedings become automatic." "Then let them become automatic," I said, leaning forward. "I won't sell. I have already lost everything," I replied, a profound, aching truth. "I lost my youth, my strength, and my son, but I haven't lost the belief. That is the one thing you and your bank cannot touch." Henderson, seeing that logic and monetary pressure were failing, packed his papers sharply. "You will regret this, Mr. Farrow. When the eviction notice comes, don't say we didn't warn you." They left as abruptly as they had arrived, the black sedan kicking up a final, angry cloud of dust. I watched the clouds settle, the silence returning, heavy and absolute. I was alone, facing inevitable ruin. The pressure was no longer abstract. It had a deadline, Monday morning. I had 3 days until the process of taking the land began. I looked down at Elis's glove. I had secured the sprouts, the symbol, but the baseline itself was crumbling. I needed to do something radical, something impossible, to prove to myself, if not to the bank, that the baseline was still secure. The sheer difficulty of watering the sprouts with only Mabel's meager help gnawed at me. She could sustain them for a week, maybe 2, but the heat was relentless, and the volume of water needed for true growth was astronomical. The solution, I realized, was not to fix the Ford, which was impossible for a broken man. The solution was the old way, the original system. I thought back to 1980, when the irrigation pipes were new, running from the deep well to the central reservoir. The pipes running to the field where the sprouts lay were still partially intact, but the main valve near the wellhead hadn't been turned in 2 decades. It was stiff, rusted, and required a massive physical exertion to budge. It was located about 150 yards beyond the range of my walker, nestled in a small, overgrown utility shed near the old silo. This was the climax, the ultimate test of whether the magnitude of my affection was truly greater than the exhaustion of living. I had to reach that valve. The next morning, before the sun crested the horizon, the time of the empty horizon sunrise, I began the attempt. I left the walker on the porch. It was useless for this kind of movement. Instead, I retrieved a heavy, canvas-covered knee pad from the defunct Ford's toolbox and strapped it over the damaged hip for minimal cushioning. I then armed myself with a specific tool, a long, heavy iron bar, usually used for levering rocks. This would serve as a crutch, a lever, and a point of purchase on the dry ground. I stepped off the porch and onto the unforgiving earth. The pain was immediate and searing, a white-hot knife twisting in my hip. I gasped, leaning heavily on the iron bar. I am fighting time itself, I thought, and time is winning the physical battle. But the image of those tiny, defiant green sprouts, struggling to survive, gave me a focus that transcended the pain. I began to drag myself. It was not crawling, nor walking. It was a desperate, lurching shuffle, using the iron bar to plant ahead and pull my weight forward, a motion that sent blinding shocks of agony through my lower body. The first 50 yards were agony. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, bathing the desolate landscape in a cruel, orange light. The dust clung to my sweat-soaked shirt. I paused every few feet, collapsing onto my good leg, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I talked to Eli, not in full sentences, but in grunts and whispered assurances. Just to the silo, son. Just to the valve. Keep the baseline secure. I passed the Ford. Its rusted hulk seemed to stare down at me, the silent witness to my ruin. I ignored it, focused only on the looming, dark shape of the silo ahead. The ground became rockier as I approached the wellhead. The pain was no longer sharp. It was a dull, overwhelming fire that had consumed my entire right side. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring with strain. When I finally reached the small shed, a dilapidated wooden structure leaning heavily to one side, I collapsed against the exterior wall, panting, the taste of dust and copper heavy in my mouth. It had taken me over an hour to travel 150 yards. The valve was inside. It was a massive rusted wheel, set low to the ground. Decades of calcium buildup and neglect had fused it shut. I tried to turn it with my hands. My deeply weathered hands, strong despite my age, slipped on the rusty metal. Nothing moved. I tried again, putting my entire remaining upper body strength into the twist. The hip protested violently and I cried out, a ragged animal sound of pure suffering. I pulled back, leaning against the cold concrete casing of the well. The exhaustion of living was crushing me. This was impossible. But then I looked out, past the shed, across the growing expanse of the Dust Bowl, claimed toward the roadside. I couldn't see the tiny sprouts, but I knew they were there, holding their ground, waiting for me to keep my end of the bargain. My love is greater than the immense exhaustion of living. I grabbed the iron bar, the lever I had dragged with me. I wedged the end of the bar into one of the spokes of the valve wheel. I had to use leverage, not brute force. I pushed, slowly, deliberately, using the full weight of my body, including the fractured hip, which was now just a numb, screaming hinge to press down on the bar. The metal groaned. A high-pitched, protesting squeal broke the morning silence. I pushed harder, picturing Eli's kind smile, picturing his booming voice over the tractor's roar. I wasn't just turning a valve, I was turning the tide. It wasn't the sound of my hip breaking further, but the sound of the rust giving way. The valve wheel moved slowly, grindingly, by perhaps an inch. I leaned back, trembling, tears mixing with the sweat and dust on my face. The pain was unbearable, but the sound of the water was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I had done it. I had anchored the baseline. I didn't stop to admire the movement. The return trip was even more difficult. The exhilaration of the victory could not overcome the physical damage. It took me nearly 2 hours to drag myself back to the farmhouse. I made it to the rocking chair porch, just as Mabel's pickup pulled up for her morning water delivery. "Arthur, what in God's name did you do?" she cried, rushing toward me. "I turned the valve, Mabel," I managed, a raspy whisper of pure pride. "The water is flowing." Mabel helped me inside, moving with a rare tenderness, immediately calling for non-emergency medical checkup, terrified I had worsened the fracture. Lying in bed later that afternoon, heavily medicated and scolded by a visiting nurse, I could hear a distant, faint sound, the gentle, steady hiss of the old irrigation pipes doing their work, soaking the earth near the sprouts. "I went out to look at the field," she said quietly. "The ground is damp, Arthur. Not soaked, but the topsoil is taking the moisture. They're drinking. The promise holds," I whispered. She looked at me, her piercing gaze softer than I had ever seen it. "You could have killed yourself, Arthur. For what? For a crop that won't yield profit and a boy who isn't coming back." "I don't know that, Mabel," I insisted. "And even if I did, the act is not for the yield, it is for the truth." The truth was simple. I was Arthur Farrow, a man who had lost everything: my physical health, my solvency, my youth, and my heir. But the magnitude of my affection for Eli, my stubborn, radical belief in his return, was the last inviolable territory of my soul. I was still standing, or rather, still lying down, having just won the most significant physical battle of my 70s. The next few days passed in a blur of recuperation. The bank's Monday deadline came and went. Henderson called once, his voice colder than before, confirming the legal process had begun. I listened, nodded, and hung up. The land was circling the drain, but the sprouts were drinking deeply. On the following Saturday, a week after I had crawled to the valve, I managed to walk slowly to the rocking chair porch, leaning on the walker. The empty horizon sunrise was breathtaking, but my attention wasn't on the sky, it was on the field. The tiny green line was now a vibrant strip of life. The sprouts, nourished by the deep well water, had grown exponentially. They were 7, 8, even 10 inches high, their leaves broad and healthy, reaching for the sun. They were a magnificent, visible declaration of life in a field of death. They were no longer sprouts, they were established plants. I settled into the rocking chair, pulling Eli's glove onto my hand, the worn leather a perfect fit. The farm was probably lost. The court would move faster than I could recover. But when Eli finally found his way back home, the baseline would be secure. He would see the dilapidated farmhouse, the dead tractor, and the sign of ruin. But he would also see the defiant, impossible field of sunflowers. They would be a testament to a father's love that refused to acknowledge defeat, a beacon cutting through the dust. My story isn't a guaranteed happy ending, where the farm is saved or the sun appears on the road. It is a testament to the radical, foolish, magnificent act of believing in the promise of tomorrow, when today has already taken too much. I may watch the long, empty road with a broken body, but I watch it next to a growing, impossible field. The seeds of hope, once sown, required only the stubbornness of a father's love to thrive. The sun climbed higher, warming the porch wood. I closed my eyes, the metallic taste of dust finally replaced by the faint, fresh scent of growing life. I carried the burden of having lost everything, yet I still rose each day believing. I knew now, with absolute certainty, that the only thing I needed to keep was the belief itself. The baseline was secure, and that in the vast, indifferent silence of the Dust Bowl claim was the final, total victory. Like and subscribe so we can do this again next week.